Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. In the late 1800s, the lynchings of African Americans by mobs of angry whites were common occurrences, but mostly in the South, which is why the beating, torture, and hanging of Robert Lewis by a white mob in Port Jervis, a tiny town only 65 miles north of New York City, stood out. Why did it happen in a place where there was only a tiny black population and where black and white citizens had coexisted peacefully? In his book, A Lynching at Port Jervis, Race and Reckoning in the Gilded Age, historian Philip Dray turns a spotlight on a largely forgotten case. He also raises the question of whether the continuing murder of black citizens at the hands of police and the ongoing spate of racially motivated mass murders are really lynchings under a different name. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
A Lynching at Port Jervis is really the third book you've written about lynching. What set you on this path, and why focus on this particular case?
I began writing about these cases really starting with the Cheney-Goodman-Schwerner murder in Mississippi in 1964, and just sort of became convinced very quickly of how central these incidents have been in the role of civil rights history. And I found it very compelling. As disturbing a subject it is, I found it a little bit hard to resist. This particular story, as you mentioned in your intro, what intrigued me was the fact that it had happened so close to New York City, and in its day was considered rather scandalous, in that people in the North had assumed that the Southern scourge of lynching, as they called it, was isolated to the Deep South. When it happened this close to New York, people were outraged. How could this happen? And it happened at a time, as you point out, when there was a great increase in the number of lynchings occurring in the South. So people in the North felt a little frightened, as though this is coming here now. What are we going to do about it? And of course, just one other thing I'll add is that when they thought that their justice system would deal with the mob, they also, like in the South, failed to do so. Exactly.
Could you just very briefly summarize what happened on June 2nd, 1892?
Sure. Port Jervis is a little town. It was a railroad and canal town, and it's also at the junction of two rivers, the Delaware and the Neversink. So it had a lot of kind of transient population, one of whom was a young salesman named Philip Foley, who had a love affair with a local, younger woman who was kind of a local belle, a white woman named Lena McMahon. Her parents disapproved of him. They thought he was kind of a out-of-town, fast-talking, a ready talker, they called him, actually. Somehow, she then fell out with her parents over this. She ran away. It's a little confusing what exactly happened. At the day of the lynching, they were camping out, so to speak, sleeping out, actually, rough, down by the riverside, as to sort of gain some freedom from her family. A black man Robert Lewis, who may or may not have been of their acquaintance, it's a little vague, somehow fell in with them, and after that, a lot of the facts get a little lost, whether he actually did assault her, or it could have almost been a kind of some suspect it was a kind of a charade in order to gain some sympathy from her parents that she had been attacked by a black man. But what happened is Robert Lewis was tracked down by a posse of white men from the neighborhood, brought back to Port Jervis before the police were unable to successfully accept him into the jail because the mob was so violent already. And he was marched up the block, 5 or 6 blocks to Main Street. The lynching occurred there in front of about 2,000 people.
What struck me most about this event was the speed and the frenzy with which it was carried out. I mean, as you said, they didn't even make it to the jail with him. I guess all mobs are crazed to some extent, but this one seemed to be especially crazed.
Right. Well, there's a phrase that lynching academics or scholars use, spontaneous vigilantism, as opposed to something that was plotted out long in advance. This was something that happened just on one afternoon. The word got out. You have to remember the background to this is that it was a time of a lot of sort of modernization in American society, including younger white women were becoming more independent, going to work, leaving the family home. And so the idea that word that a young white woman had been attacked by a black man in this small community, it set off a lot of alarm bells for people. And I think that's why the reaction was very quick and consolidated. And as you point out, it's transpired in just a couple of hours, really.
Several white men at the scene of the lynching apparently tried to stop the attack on Lewis, but were unable to do something, to do so, which I don't know, which seemed a little different from what would have happened in the South, right?
Right. No, that's true that was a difference. Although sometimes in the South too, there would be a white sheriff or somebody who was
trying to maintain order.
To sort of get things under control. Of course, you know, any of us who have watched, and almost all of us have now watched footage of the January 6th riot in Washington, you see what the power of a mob is. It's overwhelming, and even the most staunch, heroic police efforts or judges or whoever it might be are helpless against it. So you can sort of picture this mob as well in the streets of Port Jervis. There were one or two policemen who tried to intervene. One of them had his baton taken out of his hands and used against himself.
And not only was Robert Lewis hung until he was dead, I mean, there were, as happened in many other lynchings, there were people who came to collect souvenirs.
Of course. Yes, I mean, that's the collection of relics of lynchings was a phenomenon that went on everywhere. In Port Jervis, for instance, the tree from which Robert Lewis was hanged was then afterward sort of assaulted, and pieces were taken, chips of the bark. Local boys would board the trains coming through town, sort of selling these souvenirs to passengers going through, because Port Jervis had briefly become synonymous with racial intolerance and violence. So yes, you're right, that taking of relics of having been there, having witnessed this, what in a small town like that must have seemed like this epical event, was very important.
As you mentioned, about 2,000 of the town's 9,000 residents reportedly took part in the lynching or were spectators.
Right.
But afterwards, it seemed that the white residents of the town felt ashamed about what happened.
Yes. There seemed to be different stages of reaction, so to speak. I think at first there was a kind of sort of almost like a gratitude that, oh, this evil perpetrator, this sexual predator had been caught and received his just deserts. Then quickly, though, of course, once the public and the press, the press from New York and other big cities rushed to Port Jervis, what's going on? How could this happen? Then suddenly the citizens felt kind of set upon a little bit, like, well, why are we see our name being bandied about in papers from coast to coast as we're nice people really here, etc. And so they kind of went through that phase. And then there was a kind of like a resentment of all the attention as well. Like, why don't they leave us alone? Why are they picking on us, and so on. And this became manifest in the coroner's inquest was held almost immediately afterward. And really, that was the closest they came to any kind of trial of the people who were suspected of being involved. But as you can imagine, in a small town like that, people did not want to testify against their neighbors. It was very much what happened in the South, too, what inhibited prosecutions of lynch mobs.
Right.
And so eventually they went through various different hearings of various kinds. They tried to convene 2 grand juries. They just could not get people, even though they knew these people had seen with their own eyes who was responsible, who were the leaders. Eventually the coroner the verdict was that Robert Lewis had died at the hands of persons unknown, which was the euphemistic verdict often pronounced in the case of lynchings, meaning the community did this, but nobody really knows who, and let's move on.
Or we're not willing to say.
We're just not going to say who. We're
Right.
not going to, because no one is willing.
How did the black residents, and there were only 200
Yes.
of them out of a population of 9,000, how did they react to the lynching?
One of the regretful things about that is that about a generation later, when the NAACP started, they focused on finding out what the black community's version of events was. But at this time in the 1890s, all of the local press was controlled by whites.
Right.
And so
nobody was interviewing the members of the
right,
black community.
Right. The only person really who kind of zeroed in on this was Ida B. Wells, of course, the well-known anti-lynching crusader who, by the way, was just that very month starting her nationwide anti-lynching crusade. She had just been chased out of Memphis herself for her activism and was relocated to New York City, where she started writing for the New York Age, a black newspaper. And she started writing about the lynching plague in America. And she wrote about Port Jervis. So there was that reaction. Locally, the black community, the only way we know that they responded was that they insisted on the funeral and burial of Robert Lewis to be done in a respectful way.
In a public way.
In a public way, and they did not want him to be buried in like the God's Acre, the pauper's anonymous burial ground. And so he was interred in a funeral at actually the kind of scenic, so to speak, cemetery near the river in Port Jervis. One other reaction I'll just mention quickly is that a Brooklyn attorney named Rufus Perry Jr., who'd been involved working with the Legal Aid Society, the early Legal Aid Society in New York, hit upon the idea that there should be a Legal Aid Society for prosecuting lynchings. And he tried to sue the state of New York on behalf...
a civil suit on behalf of
civil suit on behalf of the family, which was in its day unprecedented. And it got some headlines. Unfortunately, it did not go... The case seems to disappear from the newspapers after a certain point. It was at a time when it was believed that you could sue a municipality for property damage, but not for the death of a citizen. In other words, it seemed like there was a kind of protection, just the way many
not for dereliction of duty. Basically.
Not right. In other words, just like a kind of qualified immunity, if you will, in a way for it.
New York is, certainly now considered a mostly liberal state, but it actually had a long history of slavery.
That's right. I know that was something that I, working on this book, actually learned about much more, which is that in the late 18th century, say, New York rivaled South Carolina for the number of enslaved persons. And many of them were concentrated in that area.
New York City?
New York City and the Hudson Valley, actually. And so I think there was something like 15,000 enslaved people just in the Hudson Valley say, would be the early 1800s. And many of their descendants still lived in the area. Now, Port Jervis had never had a large black population, possibly because it was far away from the Hudson River commerce and the farming in that area, which had involved enslaved individuals growing up there, having families and so on. But it's true that there was, in the region itself, there was a very deep, it was really a slave society.
What would it have been like for black people who lived in Port Jervis at the time?
Well, many of them lived actually out of the main part of the city. They lived in a settlement. This was very common in upstate New York and maybe elsewhere in the North too, is that after emancipation, black families often chose to live outside of a community in a settlement of their own, where they could have kind of like self-governance. And this was true in Port Jervis. Many of them lived up by a reservoir about maybe 2 miles north of the town, which was interesting in a way because when you go there now, you see, if you walk it, you see what that meant every day for people to have to walk into town to work and then walk home. It was like kind of a, but there was a small black population that did live right in the town as well. So it wasn't completely isolated.
Now the blacks and whites, I mean, there was no big history of racial violence, but the blacks were, I would assume that they held the lower level jobs.
Yes.
And that they were, second or third class citizens.
Right. No, and that was true even into the 20th century. There were kind of places that were understood. There was no formal segregation, but there were certain places, beaches, restaurants, and so on, that were understood to be off limits to local black people.
It seemed to be the consensus that Lena McMahon's boyfriend, Philip Foley,
yes,
was somehow implicated in her attack.
Yes.
But he was never charged with a crime, right?
They tried to charge him, the family tried to charge him with blackmail, that he had, because they'd found that he had sent a couple of letters to her basically asking for money. He claimed, well, we were lovers, and so I thought that she might lend me $10 or something like that. That case never really went very far, but it did allow the local police did lock him up for quite some time, probably for his own protection. Because, of course, the city once was, I think they would have lynched him as well, because he offended people, of course, too, this sort of out-of-town, good-looking man.
Bounder.
A bounder, yes, a bounder had, of course, you know, he had brought all this trouble on this local young woman and her family, who were an Irish-American family. The father was a Civil War veteran and so on. And so Philip Foley was out-of-town salesman, and people, I think, would have turned on him. They kept him locked up. And he seems to have been, he's a strange character in that when you read the history, the many quotes he gave to the local newspapers, he actually often seems like one of the few kind of like straightforward people involved in the entire thing. On the other hand, he obviously he was kind of a scoundrel, as you say, a bounder.
Yeah. What happened to Lena Monroe?
She eventually, I mean, I came to believe in a way that she was at the heart of this case in many ways. Because
that she was at the heart?
It was, because I believe she was the one who was eager to get away from her parents, and I think something happened. I think she and Philip Foley, or maybe she alone, had hooked up this kind of charade that she would be claimed to have been attacked by Robert Lewis, who may or may not have been actually there. Maybe they had argued or something. It's unclear if they knew one another. But I always felt that somehow she was involved in it somehow, and that she had helped bring this on. And that when the lynching occurred, that was not what in other words, that was not what she had expected.
Yeah.
It took on a life of its own, so to speak, that she could obviously not control. And that after that, she had a kind of a nervous breakdown. At the time, they said, oh, it's because of what she endured. But I actually think it was because she regretted what she had done. And the whole town was, I mean, here she's living in a small town. The whole town was up in arms, and their reputation was ruined, and a man was dead, and all this, and she probably felt like she had brought this on.
Yeah.
She tried to run away at one point. Eventually, the family, she came to New York at one point. She had a child in a hotel room. She had a very kind of sordid, she wound up in Bellevue briefly. And then eventually the family moved to Boston, where they had come from at one point. And she passed away, I think she lived maybe around into the 1920s.
Now, more than 4,000 African Americans who were killed by lynch mobs between 1877 and 1950, there were more than 4,000 of those. But the first conviction for a lynching in the modern era didn't come until 1967.
67, and that was the lynching of the civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner. And the way that happened was because the federal government, in other words, as you know, during much of the 20th century, there was NAACP and other organizations fought for an anti-lynching law.
Right. And they could never get it passed.
They could never get it passed, largely because even the sympathetic northern politicians could not, the southern bloc was too powerful. Right. But meanwhile, the Justice Department began to look into ways that they could reactivate actually anti-Ku Klux Klan laws from the 1870s and use them against lynch mobs. And that we still talk about those laws. They're still in use today. They're anti-conspiracy laws. And also about using the police to do like what they call under the color of law, violence or terroristic violence. So that was how they got their first lynching conviction. Okay. The federal government got a federal judge and jury in Meridian, Mississippi in 1967 to convict about half the number of people who were actually part of this lynch mob that killed those 3 civil rights workers.
You write that lynchings were not isolated events, but were part of a system deliberately calibrated to keep black people in line.
It's a sensibility that's very much with us today. It's the white resistance to change. and a feeling that black people were getting freedom, were more mobile, they were moving to cities and working in new industries. At the same time, all of society was a little bit unstable in their minds. Young white women, as I mentioned before, were leaving home, they were going to school, working in the cities and so on, in textile mills. And so there was this sense of social change and cultural change, in addition to all sorts of the invention of the automobile and all these different changes, even the bicycle, which allowed young people to ride off on their own and smoke cigarettes and do other things like that. And so there was this kind of sense of society changing, and this became a kind of institutionalized response. And again, I think we see that we're living with another version of it today. In the South at that time, they called it redemption. After the idealism of Reconstruction, which sought to spread individual freedoms more evenly, as you know, with what they call the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, granting the vote, citizenship, and so on. Redemption was a kind of quasi-religious pushback in the South that wound up, of course, creating all kinds of obstacles to voting, Jim Crow segregation as we came to know it. And I think in a way we see that an echo of it today, a little bit of what's going on with all this kind of denouncing of we don't want to learn black history, the sort of bugaboo about CRT, drag queen story hours, all this kind of reaction to progressive changes in the culture, and even just demographic changes of more people of color having more power, voting, becoming a larger part of the demographic population, basically.
Do you see a connection between the lynching in Port Jervis and what we're seeing, what is being revealed more today about unarmed African Americans getting killed by police?
Yeah.
And you think of mass shootings, like, for instance, the shooting of 9 black members of a church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015. Do you see a connection between those?
It's a kind of terrorism of a kind of what would you call it, like summary justice. In other words, justice, racially based justice or injustice, basically, that's based on police and acting out of their role in a certain way, and either being negligent or just simply brutal or terroristic. And of course, in the 19th century, lynchings were often basically allowed by law enforcement, either who looked the other way or often even were involved. And so there's that kind of continuum a bit. But I think more generally we see it in everything from the riot on January 6th to what's happening even right now. Look what's happening with, the Republicans, or the right wing is trying, MAGA, I guess you might call them, they're trying to make it so that the justice system is not valid. They're saying, well, you can't do this. They're trying to criminalize those people who are the prosecutors. And that's what I mean. It's like this, and that was similar in a way to redemption. It's like an overall assault on the liberal institutions of democracy. And of course, black people are often the victims of this. But I think there is definitely a kind of a distant mirror, you might say.
We've got about a minute left. What do you want readers to take from your book?
I know that there has been, in recent years, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, a real awakening in upstate New York about the history of civil rights in that region. There was a lynching also in Newburgh, New York, in the 1860s. Both of those sites now have had ceremonies where the state has paid to put up historical plaques. I mean, I can't tell you how little was known about these lynchings for many, many years. When I went to Port Jervis in 2018, many people who lived, white and black, who lived blocks away from where this occurred, had never heard of it, which is sort of was by design, because it was meant to kind of just like go silent, really. There was a great Black Lives Matter march right through the streets of Port Jervis, organized by young African-American women from the town, which anyone who knew about anything about the way the town had been kind of functioning were kind of stunned. And even the sort of kind of like the town fathers then got on board with it, because they saw, wow, this is really a movement, it's happening. So then they became much more involved in the focus of commemoration, trying to open up pathways of communication and so on. Obviously it's not happening overnight, but for instance, the local high school, I think, is involved in education about it and so on. So I think that was, for me, whenever you write a book, there's always a kind of sense that you're trying to it's a little presumptuous, but you're trying to tell people about something that you feel they should know about. And I think for me, having a background in the subject generally, the idea that this had occurred and was so little known, motivated. And I think that was so I've been very gratified the extent to which the book has been taken up and has generated conversations both here and in colleges around the region and so on.
Well, it's a very powerful story, and thank you for telling it.
Thanks for having me.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Philip Dray, author of A Lynching at Port Jervis, Race and Reckoning in the Gilded Age, for joining me today. Published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, the book is available in bookstores and online. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Twitter at 1-to-1 CUNY TV. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.